I remember the exact moment everything changed. Her voice cut through the forest air so sharply that even the tools around me seemed to go still. I had fresh pine dust on my hands from the cabin restoration when I turned and saw a white SUV rolling up the gravel road like it owned every inch of the property. The driver's door opened, and Patricia Miller stepped out with the kind of confidence that did not belong in a place like this. She pointed straight at the 150-year-old cabin behind me and said, "That's my son's inheritance." For a second, I just stood there. The claim made no sense against the silence of the trees, the permits in my hand, and the title records I had already verified. My name is Ethan Cole, and I restore forgotten properties for a living. I had bought that estate through a verified foreclosure sale 3 months earlier. Before I touched a board or cleared a single path, my attorney had reviewed every document twice. The ownership chain was clean. The transfer was legal. The county had signed off on the restoration work. When I first arrived, the cabin had been close to collapse. Rotting beams leaned inward. Broken windows scattered glass across the floor. The whole place smelled like wet wood, dust, and neglect. Now, after weeks of work, half of it was standing again. I had expected structural problems. I had expected budget overruns. I had not expected a stranger to show up and claim the place belonged to her family. Patricia stepped closer like the ground itself was open to negotiation. In the passenger seat, a teenage boy stared at the cabin with an expression I could not quite read. That had to be Dylan Miller, her son. I had seen the name once on an HOA contact sheet and ignored it. That was when I understood this was not simple confusion. This was someone trying to rewrite reality in real time. I looked down at the restoration plans still clipped in my hand. The property lines were clear. The deed history was even clearer. Patricia kept pointing at the cabin as if repeating a claim often enough could make it legal. She said her family had always owned the land. She said I had no right to be there. The wind moved through the trees behind me, carrying the sound of distant construction from another property. I had learned a long time ago that land remembers what people conveniently forget. And sometimes people forget only the parts that no longer benefit them. I asked her, as calmly as I could, whether she had any documentation to support what she was saying. She smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. "Paperwork is just paperwork," she said. "Everyone in Willow Creek knows the truth." That was the first moment I realized this situation was going to become something bigger than an argument. The cabin creaked softly behind me as the new beams settled into place. I was still standing there with a county-approved permit in my hand while she acted as if confidence alone outtranked law. Patricia raised her phone and started recording, as though filming the moment could somehow erase the title transfer. I looked at her, then at the cabin, then back at the permit. In that silence, one thing became clear. People like Patricia do not argue to find the truth. They argue to replace it. I stayed still for a moment longer, not because I was intimidated, but because I was trying to understand how someone could stand on legally transferred land and deny every recorded fact around her. The forest behind me felt older than the conflict already unfolding in front of the cabin. Fresh-cut pine, sealant, and old timber lingered in the air. Everything about the place said restoration. Nothing about it said dispute. I lowered the plans in my hand and took a slow breath. "My name is Ethan Cole," I said. "I don't buy property to fight over it. I buy it to restore it." That had been my work for years. I took abandoned places, mismanaged land, and decaying structures and brought them back into legal compliance and usable condition. I did not operate on assumptions. Every acquisition I handled came through foreclosure, estate transfer, or certified sale. This property had been no different. 3 months earlier, I had completed the purchase after a full title review. The ownership chain stretched back for decades without any sign of a family inheritance dispute or private claim. That was what made Patricia's certainty feel so unnatural. She was acting as though she had arrived to correct an error in the universe rather than challenge a legal record. She stood a few feet away, studying me like I was the problem. Dust moved across the gravel as the wind shifted. She tapped her phone once, still filming. Behind her, the SUV idled in the quiet. Dylan stayed in the passenger seat, but his eyes kept moving between me, the cabin, and the tools spread near the foundation. That detail stayed with me. People who know something is theirs usually do not hesitate when they see it. They recognize it immediately. Dylan looked more uncertain than possessive. Patricia repeated that the cabin belonged to her family. She said it with the kind of confidence people use when they expect no one to challenge them. I asked whether she had ever reviewed the county transfer records. Records don't matter, she said. History does. That was when I recognized the pattern. She was not trying to find out what was true. She was trying to define truth on her own terms. I reached into my jacket and felt the familiar weight of the folder I carried to every job site. Inside were the deed transfer, zoning approvals, permit records, and foreclosure documentation stamped by the county registry. I had learned early in this business that clarity only matters if the other side respects it. Patricia didn't. She gestured toward the cabin again and said Dylan had grown up hearing stories about that land. I listened, but stories were not the same as title. Family memory was not the same as ownership. Nostalgia had no legal standing. The wind shifted again, and I heard distant machinery from somewhere beyond the tree line. I had planned to spend the afternoon stabilizing the west wall and preparing the interior for restoration. Instead, I was standing in the middle of a conflict that should never have existed in the first place. Eventually Patricia stopped talking and looked at me as if she expected me to give in. I didn't answer right away. I looked at the cabin instead. It had survived weather, fire damage, neglect, and time. It had not survived people who wanted to claim it without proof. I closed the folder and made a decision without raising my voice. If you believe there's an error, I said, I'll verify your claim through official channels. She smiled again. I don't need permission to protect my family's inheritance. That was when I understood this was no longer about restoration. It was about control. I could feel the shift before she spoke again. Patricia was not the kind of person who backed away once she had chosen her version of reality. She lifted her phone higher and framed the cabin as if she were documenting a crime scene instead of a lawful restoration project. Gravel crunched under her shoes as she moved to get a better angle. Dylan stayed inside the SUV but leaned forward, watching more closely now. I kept my place near the edge of the foundation. The scaffolding on the east side still stood where I had replaced damaged beams that morning. Fresh lumber and cold forest air mixed together in a way that made everything feel unfinished, tense, and temporary. When Patricia spoke again, her voice was louder. She accused me of trespassing on private family heritage land and destroying an inherited estate. I asked her one more time whether she had a recorded deed, probate filing, or county document to support the claim. She avoided the question. Instead, she said truth could not always be found in paperwork. That told me more than any direct answer would have. In property disputes, people who reject records usually do so because the records do not support them. I stepped toward the restoration table and set my folder down carefully. Inside were the title documents, the foreclosure transfer, and the county verification that had cleared the project before the first hammer ever touched the structure. Restoration without legal clarity is just gambling with expensive lumber. Patricia noticed the folder. For a fraction of a second, she hesitated. Then she shook her head and said documents could be manipulated. That was when I understood explanation alone would never resolve this. The wind moved through the trees again. The cabin gave a soft creak as the new framing settled into place. I had reinforced the structure after finding major rot in the original support lines. Every repair had been documented and prepared for inspection. None of that seemed to matter in Patricia's version of events. She pointed at the cabin and said Dylan had heard stories about spending time there when he was younger. She claimed those stories gave him an emotional right to the property. I looked toward the SUV. Dylan was still watching me. There was uncertainty in his face now, and it did not match his mother's confidence. I asked Patricia whether she had ever filed a probate claim or contacted the county about inheritance rights. She dismissed the question. Legal systems are slow, she said. Family truth comes first. That was the second time she separated law from truth, as if the two had nothing to do with each other. The cabin stood between us like a witness. So far, I had stabilized the main frame and replaced nearly 40% of the exterior structure. It was still a work in progress, but it was no longer collapsing. Patricia looked at it and said she would not let outsiders erase her family's legacy. I'm not erasing anything, I said. I'm restoring what I legally bought. Ownership without memory means nothing, she shot back. That was when I finally saw the shape of the conflict. She was not trying to win an argument. She was trying to overwrite the record with a story. I closed the folder and told her she was free to submit any claims she wanted through the county. She smiled like I had just confirmed her power instead of challenged it. I don't need permission from a system that forgot my family, she said. I stood there a second longer and looked at the half-restored cabin behind me. This was no longer just a dispute over a building. It was a fight over who got to control the narrative of ownership. I remained where the gravel met the edge of the foundation and watched Patricia shift from filming to speaking like she was issuing a final ruling. Her phone stayed raised, but the performance had changed. She was not documenting anymore. She was announcing. She said she was calling the Homeowners Association Enforcement Board and reporting me for unauthorized construction. The way she said it made it sound as if the verdict had been decided before she ever arrived. I had dealt with property disputes before, but this one moved to a different rhythm. It was not grounded in inspection reports, code violations, or title defects. It was built on confidence, repetition, and the assumption that sounding official would be enough. I told her again that I had purchased the property through a verified foreclosure sale, and that all restoration work had been approved through county permits. She shook her head as if paperwork were just background noise. Then she said something that should have been impossible. The Homeowners Association had jurisdiction over all land activity in Willow Creek regardless of ownership status. Behind her, Dylan finally stepped out of the SUV. He did not go to her side. He stayed near the open door and looked at the cabin as if he was trying to reconcile what he had been told with what he was seeing. His eyes lingered on the fresh beams and the rebuilt section of the porch. There was hesitation in his posture. Patricia had certainty. Dylan had questions. She turned toward him and said everything would be handled. She also said they had protected that land for years. The word protected caught my attention. It suggested control, not ownership. I walked back to the restoration table and opened the folder again. I laid out the county approvals, deed transfer, and certified foreclosure sale records where anyone could see them. Patricia looked at the documents but did not come closer. Instead, she said county systems often failed to reflect community agreements, and that an HOA covenant superseded outdated records. I asked what agreement she was talking about. Without hesitation, she named it, the Willow Creek Heritage Covenant. I had never seen that title in any title search, zoning review, or legal assessment. That was the first point where her claims stopped sounding confused and started sounding manufactured. I asked whether she had a copy. It's internal, she said. It doesn't need to be publicly disclosed. The wind moved through the trees, and the cabin settled again on its repaired foundation. I had reinforced that structure myself after removing sections weakened by years of decay. Every change had been measured and documented. Patricia stepped toward the scaffolding and pointed at it. She said I had altered protected historical architecture without approval from the association's Heritage Committee. I asked when that committee had been formed and under what legal authority it operated. She did not answer. Instead, she said some things exist because the community agrees they exist. Dylan shifted his weight and finally spoke. Quietly, almost carefully, he asked his mother whether the land was actually in their name anywhere on an official record. The question hung in the air. Patricia turned sharply toward him. Records don't define family history. I closed the folder and looked at both of them. At that moment, the conflict was stripped down to its simplest form. One side had documents. The other had repetition. And for the first time, Dylan seemed to understand the difference. I stayed where I was long enough to realize that silence was becoming a strategy. Patricia was no longer trying to persuade me through facts. She was building a case through tone, posture, and the appearance of authority. She stepped back toward her SUV and began speaking into her phone in a voice that turned instantly formal. She reported an active violation of protected land protocol and demanded enforcement action. I listened carefully. The terminology sounded official at first, but none of it matched standard county or state language. Dylan remained outside the vehicle, arms tense at his sides. He looked from me to the cabin and back again, as if he were trying to decide which version of the day would survive. I did not move from the restoration table. The air smelled of pine resin and freshly cut wood. I had spent weeks stabilizing the structure after years of abandonment. Every replacement beam had been photographed, logged, and prepared for inspection. Patricia ended the call and announced that an enforcement officer was on the way to issue a cease-and-desist order. I asked what legal authority supported the order. She replied that the Willow Creek Heritage Covenant overrode county jurisdiction within designated historical zones. That might have sounded convincing to someone unfamiliar with property law. It did not sound convincing to me. Before purchasing the land, I had reviewed the zoning maps and historic registry. The parcel carried no such designation. That gap was now at the center of everything. I opened my folder again and checked the deed transfer, more out of habit than doubt. The record was clean, dated, and tied to a federally backed foreclosure process. Patricia ignored the papers and pointed toward the cabin instead. She said pre-approval was required for any restoration on protected family heritage structures, regardless of ownership. At that point, the argument was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about replacing law with assertion. Dylan stepped a little closer to the work zone. His voice was much quieter than his mother's, but it was also far more precise. "Is there any chance the county records are right?" he asked. "And the family stories just aren't legally binding?" Patricia turned on him immediately and said the community had always respected their stewardship of the land. That word mattered. Stewardship is not ownership. It is the language people use when they have responsibility, memory, or access, but not title. I closed the folder again and set it on the table. A few seconds later, Patricia got another call. Her expression shifted. She said the enforcement officer had reached the perimeter and would be coming in shortly. I looked toward the tree line. There was no marked county vehicle. No official SUV. No uniformed presence. Just a white pickup truck parked near the road. No county seal. No agency markings. Patricia motioned toward it as if the truck alone proved her point. I remained still and watched. The cabin stood between us, half restored, sun catching its exposed beams. Through years of dealing with permits, inspectors, and property transfers, I had learned one simple rule: real authority does not need to announce itself loudly. It arrives with jurisdiction, documentation, and a clear chain of command. What was happening here had none of those things. Patricia repeated that all restoration had to stop until verification was complete. I answered calmly. I will comply with any lawful order issued by a recognized authority. That one condition unsettled her. It introduced a standard she could not control. The white pickup stayed where it was. No one had stepped out yet. The wind moved through the unfinished structure, and the new beams gave a soft shifting sound. I took one step back from the table and watched everyone carefully. The next move was going to decide whether this was a misunderstanding that could be corrected or a constructed claim that would collapse under its own weight. I noticed the change before anyone spoke. The white pickup had not moved, but its presence altered the whole atmosphere. Patricia straightened as if the truck had arrived carrying the proof she had been missing all day. Dylan stayed near the SUV, his attention split between me, the cabin, and the figure still hidden inside the vehicle. I remained at the restoration table with my folder closed beside me. Wind moved through the trees and rattled something lightly against the scaffolding. Then Patricia raised one hand as if signaling command and announced that the enforcement officer had arrived to execute a formal cease-and-desist order. I asked, calmly and clearly, who had issued the order and whether she had written proof of jurisdiction. She did not answer the question directly. Instead, she said Willow Creek Heritage Enforcement operated under community mandate and did not require county approval for emergency action. That confirmed everything I had suspected since the beginning. This was not law. It was theater dressed in legal language. The driver's door of the pickup finally opened. A man stepped out holding a clipboard. He wore a plain jacket with no insignia, no badge, and no visible identification. He looked first at the cabin, then at Patricia, as if waiting for cues instead of following procedure. That detail mattered. Real enforcement begins with records, not eye contact. Patricia hurried toward him, pointed at the restoration work, and claimed I was destroying protected heritage property. He nodded before asking a single question or reviewing a single document. Dylan took one step forward. "Is he actually with the county?" he asked. Patricia answered for the man. She said he had been assigned through the Community Enforcement Board. I opened my folder, pulled out the deed transfer, and placed it in plain view on the table. The man glanced at it but did not come closer. Instead, he told me restoration had to pause pending further review. I asked him to show written authorization or cite the legal basis for his instruction. He hesitated, then repeated that he was acting under Community Enforcement Authority. That was when the entire structure of the situation exposed itself. It was circular. The authority existed because it claimed it existed. Patricia looked satisfied, as if the mere presence of a man with a clipboard settled everything. She repeated that the cabin was part of her son's inheritance, and that I was violating protected community land. Dylan looked down at the deed on the table, then back up at the cabin. I could see him comparing the visible facts with the story he had been given. I asked the man whether he had verified ownership through the county registry. He did not answer. He simply repeated that I needed to stop work. I placed both hands on the table and kept my voice steady. I will comply immediately if you provide verified jurisdiction from a county or state office. Patricia cut in and said county approval was not required under Heritage Covenant enforcement. I asked for the covenant. She said it was internal HOA documentation. At that point, the missing evidence became the most important fact in the entire clearing. The cabin behind me had not changed. What had changed was the nature of the conflict. This was no longer about ownership alone. It was about whether authority could exist without proof. Dylan asked the man directly whether he was law enforcement. The man hesitated again. Then he said he was authorized through community protocol. That hesitation was enough. I closed the folder and looked at both of them. I'll wait for written notice from a recognized government authority, I said. Until then, I will not alter or suspend legally approved restoration work. The forest went quiet around us. And in that quiet, the claim to authority started to crack. I stood still as the silence settled over the clearing. The man with the clipboard remained where he was, neither advancing nor retreating, like someone waiting for confidence to do the work that documentation should have done. Patricia still held herself like the outcome had already been decided. Dylan stayed a little behind her, but his focus kept returning to the papers on my table. The restoration site itself was stable. Fresh timber framed the front of the cabin. The exposed beams carried the scent of recent work, and sawdust warmed by the afternoon light. Weeks of careful effort stood in plain sight. I broke the silence by asking the man again to identify the issuing authority and produce written documentation consistent with county or state enforcement standards. He glanced at Patricia before replying. That glance told me more than his words. He repeated that he was operating under community authorization for the Willow Creek Heritage Zone. I told him plainly that I could not recognize any enforcement action without verifiable jurisdiction from a government entity. Patricia stepped forward and claimed the Homeowners Association had long-standing rights over historic properties in the area and that legal ownership did not override heritage protection agreements. I asked her to produce the original signed agreement creating those rights. She said it was maintained internally by the association and not subject to outside disclosure. That answer visibly changed Dylan's expression. He looked down for a moment, then back at the cabin, as though the story he had inherited was beginning to lose its shape. The man with the clipboard finally walked closer and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It was not a county document. It had no seal, no case number, no agency header, and no official identifier. Just generic language about community standards and restoration restrictions. Patricia said it was enough to stop all work immediately. I examined it without touching it at first. Then I told them any real restriction on property use had to come through a recognized public authority and be traceable through the county record. The man did not dispute that. He simply repeated that I was instructed to pause work. I looked at the county permits on my table. They were clear, signed, and tied to a licensed inspection process. The contrast between those documents and his paper was absolute. Dylan stepped closer and asked whether there was a file number for the order or any public record of the covenant Patricia kept invoking. Again, the man hesitated. Then he said those records were handled internally by the community board. That answer confirmed exactly what I was dealing with. This was not a legal system. It was a closed loop of self-declared power. Patricia took that absence of outside validation as proof of legitimacy. I took it as proof of weakness. I rested one hand on my folder and told them that I would comply immediately with any verified legal order from a county or state official, but not with unsupported internal directives. The wind moved through the trees again. The cabin gave a soft creak as the new structure adjusted under its own weight. The man stepped back. For the first time, Patricia hesitated. She tried to regain control by warning me about fines and escalation through community channels. I asked a simple question: who would issue the fines, and under what legal authority would they be enforced? She did not answer. That silence mattered. The balance in the clearing had shifted. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. This was no longer a fight over a cabin. It was a test of whether an unverified system could survive once someone refused to be intimidated by it. I let the silence stretch long enough for it to become evidence. The man with the clipboard stopped speaking. Patricia stopped issuing commands with the certainty she had carried earlier. Even Dylan had gone quiet. He was no longer reacting to the scene. He was studying it. I opened my folder again, this time with purpose. From inside, I removed the sealed county title certification and laid it flat on the table. The difference was immediate. The paper carried official stamps, registry numbers, and traceable signatures from the county recorder's office. I did not need to raise my voice. The document spoke clearly. Enough on its own. I said that every stage of restoration on the property had been approved following a lawful foreclosure acquisition and verified ownership transfer. The man with the clipboard looked at the certification differently than he had looked at anything else that day. His hesitation was no longer procedural. It was recognition. Patricia stepped forward and insisted community enforcement still applied regardless of ownership. I asked her a direct question: what government agency had granted her organization enforcement power over privately recorded land? She did not name one. She simply repeated the phrase community authority, but now it sounded thinner than before. Dylan moved closer to the table and studied the seal. He asked whether this was the same parcel connected to the inheritance story he had grown up hearing. Patricia answered before I could. She said paperwork did not define legacy and that some properties belonged to families even after administrative transfer. But the line no longer carried force. It sounded like repetition under pressure. I placed a second document beside the first, the complete foreclosure acquisition report, including the bank transfer confirmation and auction settlement records. Together, the two documents formed a clean chain that was difficult to dispute even without legal training. The man stepped back from the table. He never touched either document. Instead, he said he needed to confirm the matter with the community board before taking further action. I told him that verification through official channels was the right next step. Patricia objected immediately. She claimed delay would cause irreversible damage to protected heritage property. I asked again for any county or state designation showing the cabin was legally protected under a historical registry. She gave no answer. That absence said more than any argument she had made all afternoon. Dylan turned toward her now, not me, and asked whether the inheritance claim had ever been filed through probate court. The question hung between them. Patricia answered by saying the community had always recognized her family's connection to the land. I replied calmly, "That community recognition without legal registration does not create ownership under any enforceable property system." The forest seemed quieter than before. I reached into the folder one last time and removed the trust activation notice connected to the acquisition. It listed the property under a private restoration trust established through lawful registration. I placed it on top of the other documents. That was the turning point. Every claim Patricia had made existed outside the recorded structure in front of her. Every claim I had made existed inside it. The man with the clipboard finally said he would pause all enforcement activity pending legal review. Patricia reacted immediately and said that was unacceptable under community protocol. But her voice no longer sounded certain. It sounded urgent. Dylan remained silent, still looking at the documents like he was watching a story come apart in real time. I closed the folder and told them restoration would continue under full legal authorization and that any dispute would have to move through formal legal channels. Nobody answered. The SUV idled in the background. The white pickup remained parked at the edge of the property. But whatever authority it had seemed to represent had already begun to dissolve. By late afternoon, the clearing felt strangely still. The tension had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. The man with the clipboard had already stepped back toward the pickup and was making a quiet phone call. Patricia remained near the edge of the restoration zone, though the certainty that had carried her earlier was no longer intact. Dylan stood closest to the table now, looking at the documents instead of the cabin. I stayed where I was, with the county title certification, foreclosure transfer, and trust activation notice laid out in order. Then I said what had become obvious to everyone present. Any further enforcement action would need to be verified through proper county authority before it could be considered valid. The man stopped, turned partway back, and looked down at the device in his hand as if searching for confirmation that never came. Patricia jumped in immediately. She insisted. Community enforcement did not require outside validation and that heritage protection gave her the right to stop all restoration work. I asked once more what legal entity had granted that power. She did not answer. She only repeated the phrase community mandate, and by then it sounded less like authority than maintenance of a failing argument. Dylan spoke again, quietly but clearly. He asked whether all of the documents I had shown were actually registered with the county recorder's office. I told him they were, and I placed one final confirmation sheet on the table, complete with registry reference and time-stamped recording number. That was the moment the situation fully split in two. On one side stood assertion. On the other stood record. The man with the clipboard finally said he could not proceed without county confirmation of jurisdiction. Patricia turned to him immediately and demanded an explanation. He told her there was no active county order and no enforceable directive matching the papers she had produced. Silence followed. This time, it was final. Dylan looked at his mother, then back at the documents. For the first time that day, there was no uncertainty in his expression. Patricia insisted the community board had always handled matters like this internally. The man answered that internal agreements held no legal standing in property enforcement, unless they had been properly registered through the county. That stripped the last layer of support from her position. I did not interrupt. I simply watched. Patricia looked around as if she expected someone else to step in and restore the authority she had claimed all afternoon. No one did. The pickup remained parked at the edge of the property. The SUV behind her continued idling, but it no longer seemed connected to power. It was just another vehicle in the trees. The man with the clipboard said all enforcement activity was suspended pending proper legal review. He did not look at Patricia when he said it. He looked at the documents. She tried to answer, but her voice had changed. It was no longer directive. It was defensive. Dylan stepped slightly closer to me and asked, in a lower voice, whether that meant the property legally belonged to the trust. I told him ownership had been recorded and verified before restoration ever began. He nodded slowly. Patricia said nothing. I secured the documents inside the folder and closed it. The sound was soft but final in the open air. Then I told them restoration would continue under full legal authorization and that any further dispute would have to go through formal judicial channels. No one objected. The man returned to his truck. Patricia stood still for another moment, then turned toward the SUV without another word. Dylan followed her, but before he got in, he looked back at the cabin one last time. The forest settled around us again. The structure behind me stood where it had always stood, damaged, repaired, and legally mine to restore. What had started as a claim built on repetition ended in the presence of a record that could be verified. And in the quiet that followed, the lesson was impossible to miss. Authority can pretend for a while. But in the end, if it cannot be proven, it does not survive.